Hi, Koa.
Hi, Rebecca.
You know what I love? I love the human ability to adapt. Like, look at us. Look what we're doing. What are we doing? I know, but it's kind of great too. And I'm so happy to see you. Listen, it is a hell of a time to publish a book called White Feminism. Talk to me about the title, right? How it how you decided on that title, if you anticipated pushback. I know that Gloria's blurb was, don't read a book by its cover, right? I mean, when I first heard it, I was like, oh, I was like, so let's just talk a little bit about that to kind of get it out of the way so that people really understand what you meant when you chose that title.
Sure. Well, thank you so much to Michael and Books Are Magic, and especially you for taking the time to have this conversation, especially given everything that's happened yesterday and the preceding year. So, with regards to the title, I was very clear with my publisher that I was married to that title. While I was really flexible on subtitle and we went through quite a bit, to be explanatory, my editor agreed with me that the book would be called White Feminism, and that is what I proposed. I really wanted it to be the primary title of the book. First, because white feminism is a word that is very polarizing, but also for very good reason. A lot of women and non-binary people in my own life, in my own family, and a number of people that I've interviewed throughout my career, they know exactly what white feminism is. And when you use a word like that, it brings up a whole complex terrain about like gender and race and class. And yet, in a lot of professional environments that I've worked in, and then other feminist spaces that I've navigated, which I do detail in the book, white feminism is a word that inspires a whole other host of emotions, usually from, to my assessment, people who are white feminists or who practice a white feminist ideology and hear a word like that and either get very defensive or, decry that it's somehow like being divisive, which I also get into in the book as well. So I think that in terms of exploring the ideology, which is what the book is, I think it was very important that it be called that, but also to draw people on both sides of the spectrum. So people who, are white feminists and their politics and their ideologies and, to my assessment should not be, but also even like people in my own life who know what that word is, or can make a joke about Lena Dunham or like a really flippant comment about the wing or something like that, but don't necessarily know why. They don't necessarily know the ideology and the history and how deep those roots of white supremacy go.
Exactly. I mean, and that is why, I mean, as Rebecca Traister said, it's a compelling, pleasurable read. It's also a real education, right? Because when I think about white feminism, I mean, I can think of several very specific anecdotes that kind of embody that for me. And I wonder, before we get sort of really into the meat of the book, if you could share an anecdote from your personal life and experience that you think really sums up kind of poignantly what white feminism means to you.
Sure. So I feel like in my own life, I feel like I've in a lot of ways taken my own fluency and navigation of white feminism kind of for granted, because having covered gender for 10 years, and I also went to a women's college, that considered itself to be a very feminist literate place and environment, white feminism is always in the room or there in some way. And I've spoken, on panels in my career, and you can always kind of identify, or at least I can, like a very different sort of ideology that's different than what I'm talking about, or like other women or non-binary people in the room are talking about. But in terms of a pointed example, one of the examples that I lay really bare in the introduction is that at one of my media jobs, I was tasked with generating a lot of like long form coverage. So not like those news stories, that are like have an hour shelf life, and it's like this person did something stupid, but I was in charge of like features. And it became clear to me pretty easy in my own pitching in terms of stories that I wanted on the site, that were about like trans men who were weighing their birthing options, or like poor women not being able to afford diapers, or women in a different part of the world who were picking up on this very harmful practice of skin bleaching, like stuff like that. When I would pitch to my feminist identified boss, I noticed a pattern in terms of, some of my ideas were accepted, and I was, very celebrated in the company, but I could see a clean pattern in terms of what was not accepted. And a lot of my pitches about, for instance, like trans men is one of the examples that I use. She would often write back niche, and that would be the criticism that I would get. And so I learned sort of very quickly, yet in real time, that what was a primary gender issue to me, poor women not being able to afford diapers, undocumented women, that sort of thing, was considered a secondary gender issue by the outlet. And this was an outlet that, prided itself on quote unquote feminist coverage. And yet if you actually like went through the site every day, much in the way that I had to do professionally, everything really revolved around like white straight women of a certain class, either like trying to pay off student loan debt, or like starting a business, or like seeking out a heterosexual relationship with a cis man who also like did laundry. Like that was the feminist reality.
Right. All of that. I mean, I'm thinking more in terms of, like, okay, for example, even before I kind of had white feminism in my vernacular when I was in college, I had a sort of not a scuffle, but an incident with a white woman who was certainly self-declared feminist. And I approached her and said, we need to have a conversation about this. And she said, you can't just come into my space, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's what I mean. Like that kind of like, to me, that is this kind of like, we are this in this space and you are not allowed to penetrate it, right? Which I think is adjacent or is also included in what you are talking about.
No, I think that's very similar. I can give another anecdote. This is not in the book, but part of what prompted me to write this book and do the research that I did is that, like I said, I was doing a lot of speaking engagements, and every engagement I did, this is around the time of like Me Too, there would be a young person who would raise their hand and ask me directly about white feminism. And they were usually talking about some version of what you're talking about, like, having gone to Women's March with a bunch of their friends, and then in this highly politicized, activated climate, they would start to hear either like really racist or classist, ableist comments from their friends who are advocating for a feminist reality, or, similarly with their families, or, like people they work with. And so I always had like a lot I wanted to say on that, like more so than, the 3 minutes I was allotted on a panel. But more importantly, at one of these speaking engagements, a young woman in the very back did ask me, and she was clearly very, upset and honestly like scared to ask something like that in front of a room where there probably are a lot of white feminists. So to like use a word like that is immediately going to split the room, especially for that space. And I remember like answering her, and one of her specific questions to me was like, how do I fix this? And I let her talk, and then I responded, and I was like, that's not your responsibility to, correct the ills of white feminism. Like there are many movements that you can join and be a part of that are not operating under this ideology. But as soon as I said that, another woman was clearly offended by my comments, because clearly I should have espoused that, like, oh, you should, work 24/7 to change the minds of your white feminist friends, and like you should take up that unpaid labor along with everything else that you do. And this woman got up and lectured me about having empathy. And I consider that to be a big confrontation with white feminism.
Right. I found it really interesting that, in the introduction, like the first two sentences, you you talk about what you are not as opposed to what you are.
Mhm.
Why did you make that choice?
Well, um, in my own career, like about 7 years ago, I wrote an essay that went viral about passing as both white and
Mm-hmm.
straight. And
Mm-hmm.
passing is something that I've given a lot of thought to in my own life, especially given the dynamics in my family. But also, when I started working professionally and was in a lot of like white collar spaces, started to become more sensitive to how I was reading to people, who were not my friends and didn't necessarily know, my family history or know that like I have a female partner. And so it was generally a pretty like shitty experience. I mean, even though I'm very clear in the introduction that I think that passing has afforded me a lot of mobility, especially within media, which is notoriously racist. Passing is a very loaded history in this country. And I think that particularly, when I was like in my late teens, early 20s, there was this whole narrative building about this like mixed race utopia that was happening. I'm a biracial person. A number of my friends are as well. I know your son is mixed race. And there was like this growing narrative of like, this is progress, like this is the utopia, everybody being mixed race. And I really wanted to undercut that by putting a narrative out there that continues the narrative of passing, that is like this
Right.
still happens. And it's generally, for me at least, a really diminishing experience where colleagues have felt really comfortable saying super racist things in front of me because they do read me as white, or they felt comfortable saying really homophobic things in front of me because they assume that I'm straight, all of that. And so for the reader, I wanted to address that right away, also to incorporate my experiences with passing in terms of how we're thinking about power, because I didn't want to um, sort of put the reader on an on ramp that did follow that sort of like mixed race utopia narrative. Like I'm talking about something that challenges power.
Yeah, no, I mean, you mentioned, that my son is mixed race, which he is, and when he was really little, he was, beautiful to white people, like, and I was like, and I would I would often say, you can't fuck up the mixed kids, it's like, it's really tough to fuck up the mixed kids. But then I also found myself feeling like I don't actually want to raise him as a biracial. I mean, it's up to him, how he wants to identify, but I
Yeah.
do very much encourage him to identify as Black and mixed race. Is
Mhm.
that not a choice that you have embraced? Do you consider
Um,
yourself Black?
I do. I think that so I think maybe this was like 10 or 15 years ago. If nobody's read it, Zadie Smith wrote this incredible essay. I think it's based on a graduation speech she gave, where she talked about why she identifies as Black and not biracial, and it's an incredible essay
Yeah.
and was very important to me. I think because of how light I am and the mobility in which I've had, especially within institutions. I certainly identify as Black, but I also identify as biracial and mixed race. And especially when I was little, I felt a lot of fluidity with those terms. But I
Hmm.
think that
Hmm.
also mirrors, like when you are as light as I am, um, fluidity kind of defines a lot of my experience with
Right.
race. And that,
Right.
my wife is white. And when I'm with her, like I weirdly get like upgraded to white. Like
Right.
people think I'm white when
Right.
I'm walking with
Right.
her.
Right. Yeah.
But like when but I've also noticed over the years, like when I'm with, predominantly friends of color and like my wife is not with me, I read as like vaguely of color. I've also
Right.
noticed over the years, like a lot of Black colleagues sometimes will look at me in meetings, and then when everybody gets up, they'll say like, "Which one of your parents is Black?"
Yes. No,
um,
totally. There
so
was
it's a
there was
very, yeah.
recently an essay by Harry Ziad. Am I saying his name right? For Out, and who is light skinned, but he wrote this piece about how we see each other, which is
Yeah,
pretty moved. Yeah. Yeah.
and it's a very I think it's a sort of like personal navigation that I've always had trouble over the years, like really distilling to another person, because those lenses by which people see you can shift so dramatically.
Right.
And you're not even necessarily, or at least I haven't always been aware of it until I am. And
Right.
especially in terms of like the attention that those things get, because, like I talk about this in the book too, like no policeman has ever come up to me in my life and been like, why are you loitering?
Mm-hmm.
I always get like the best service when I go into a bank.
Yeah.
As when I talk to, customer service people on the phone, I always get the best service. And so sometimes in professional environments, that can shift where all of a sudden I not only have those privileges, but then somebody is clearly seeing me as like not having those privileges. And it can
Right.
bounce back and forth depending on those very, very two observations of me. It's
Right.
such different ways of seeing.
I mean, that brings me to another thing that you mentioned in the introduction, which is, this assertion that if you're light enough to pass, that you should ascend toward whiteness, right? Like it's an uptick, right? It's something you should aspire toward, and you don't. And I wondered if you could speak to why that is not, an upgrade specifically for you.
Well, I think that along with being very light, I'm also very consistently conventionally feminine. And so, me being the racial background that I have and also being queer, me sitting in, a very elite brand wearing, a dress and heels and makeup and appearing white to power holders is not progress, because I'm very aware as I sit there that, like, if I was, masculine of center in the way that my wife is, or, if I was darker, like in the way that some other women in my family are, I would definitely not be treated that way. And I've always been aware of that since I was quite young. So I think that while it may benefit me, it's not indicative of like collective progress, because it's still, the thresholds are still markers of assimilation, basically, especially to those power holders.
And you do talk in the book about feminist branding, right? In the sort of like the marketing of feminism, corporate feminism. But you, as you say yourself, I mean, you have a very distinct aesthetic.
Mhm.
How does that idea of marketing feminism or presenting white feminism inform or influence your own personal style?
Well, I think that uh, a difference I have always felt in those spaces, when you're talking about like a quote unquote empowering conference, or like a co-working space, or a brand that prides itself on being feminist. I mean, I love pink, and I particularly love pastels. My really good friend Kenny Perry is watching, and she loves pink just as much as I do. It's something we share. I like bows, I like lace, but I do not think that these aesthetics should be homogenized as a feminist aesthetic.
But they
Nor
are, which is just why I'm
they
asking,
are.
right? But they are, right. So I just wonder, I mean, as
um,
somebody who loves style too, and
yeah.
being mindful of, you mentioned wearing an elite brand, like liking nice things. I mean, I talk about this in my book as well. Just like, what does that mean? Like liking lattes, does that make me, less black?
Mhm.
That kind of thing, I think, is important to interrogate and be in conversation with. As much as we can in terms of controlling that narrative. I think if we are talking about aesthetic and presentation and assumption, um, that we should be able to have that involved in the conversation.
Well, and also one thing that I like to think of, especially given all the brands that I've worked at in my career, you know, if we're talking about clothes, for instance, and like presentation, there's style and then there's fashion. There are
Mm,
pieces where they overlap and it's like a Venn diagram, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And I think that merits more like scrutiny, especially in terms of, like lifestyle politics, and like basically like purchasing your politics and like advertising your politics on your person, which is the big enduring white feminist strategy. The
sure
suffragettes did that as
is.
well.
Sure is. Yeah. I mean, I think also about the part in your book you talk about the wing, and the, you know, the sort of feminist social club that everybody was so excited about, and then they started to take some criticism, and they kind of sidestepped, as you said, sort of addressing it head on. What should they have done?
I think it's unclear to me, especially having done so much reporting for this book and having done so much media analysis. It's unclear to me, even on this side of the book, what the politics of those founders are.
Yeah.
So I can't really ascribe an avenue because I don't entirely understand what they were trying to do in the first place.
Really? You don't?
I, No, I mean, the thing is, if you want to have like, a very elite space, there's Soho House.
Right. So
That,
my interpretation was that it was Soho House for white feminist branding, and like through that lens. And it became to me, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, but it became even more clear to me that it was a white feminist lens in terms when it was clear how they were going to represent people of color, or how they were going to utilize people of color, right? And, you know, this kind of idea of inclusiveness, which to me was quite performative,
yeah,
which I think is very much a part of white feminism. No?
very, very, very much so. One of the really enduring penchants of white feminism that I document in the book is that ideology has always been deeply skilled with optics.
Yes.
And it
Yes.
doesn't matter whether it's like Instagram or 50 international newspapers.
Yeah.
They are always really good at image and branding and marketing and presenting their causes or their politics in extremely aesthetic ways. One of the women I include in the book is a woman named Doris Stevens, who was a very prominent suffragette in the United States. And one of the things that she did, which you could totally fast forward 100 years and could happen on Instagram now, is that she was trying to work with Latin American feminists because they were trying to get together like a more global look at women's rights. And in this time in the United States, white women had just won the right to vote. And so she kind of took it upon herself to like impart what she knew to a lot of these Latin American feminists. But she was super imperialistic in what she was trying to do. She was basically trying to organize a group where she would still be the dominant power and dictate like what was a woman's issue. But one of the things she was really good at is that she had very high press and photography budgets. So while
Uh-huh.
she was disenfranchising all these Latin American feminists, who were trying to resist American imperialism, trying to get like better wage protections, she would do these sprawling photo ops with like different women from all over the world, where they'd be like photographed, with palm trees and being like very chummy and like strategizing. And she would take these images and she would export them to newspapers all over the world, which more or less happens on Instagram now.
Yeah, exactly. And I wonder if it's because, you know, immediately think of Birth of a Nation, and I think of this image of the
Mm,
chaste white woman who her aesthetic, her image is more important than anything, right?
mhm.
And if that has sort of been something cultivated, internalized throughout the centuries, that makes white feminists so good at optics, maybe.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. I mean, I think very early on in the suffrage movement in this country, the idea even that all these suffrage groups, and I'm talking specifically of the middle to upper class white suffrage groups, would design images in-house of what a suffragette looked like. And that was very
Right.
intentional, in that they wanted to sort of, again, play to this really optical understanding of of feminism, primarily to circumvent like harassment and assault, and that, you know, women who spoke publicly on street corners and who, you know, had political ideas that were not that of their husbands, or, you know, who dedicated themselves to work that were outside the home, those were deviant women. And so they erected their way around this was through basically partnering with consumerism and also erecting this huge PR campaign. And when I was doing research for this book, it's really interesting to go through the archives and see how homogenized the suffragettes is, because there were Black women advocating for the vote, there were Native women advocating for the vote, but when these specific white middle to upper class suffrage groups got together and started making this PR campaign, their homogenized version of what a suffragette was always young. She was white, she was very thin, she aspired to heterosexuality, she aspired to be a wife, she aspired to be a mother, she was always like shielding a baby, you know, with and that was very intentional and also savvy on their part, in that they weren't trying to necessarily break too much from what, you know, a woman was supposed to be, and all these really complex like American values. White feminism of that time and that white middle to upper class like suffrage movement, they were trying to convey to America that they shared these values. And therefore, when you think about rights for women, you're supposed to think about these young white women who want to be moms, who want to be good wives, who like will still shop and buy things and like be, you know, respectable women. And that's a strategy that works now too.
Right. Totally. You know, and I was thinking about how, you know, sort of the out-facing media take of the pandemic regarding gender has been, men need to help their wives more, husbands need to do more work, and women, it's taking such a toll on women and mothers and so on and so forth. But I wondered for you how that, you know, right, how that has played out in your own personal, like, how do you take that in and process that?
I remember very early in the pandemic, like when schools started to shut down and white collar workers were starting to be kept at home or, you know, told not to come into the office, there was a slate of all these, like, tonally they had the dusting of like a trend piece, you know, where it's like all these middle class mothers of different races, you know, talking about how hard everything is, like exactly what you're saying, and how they're like really burned out, and they are tasked with not just, you know, homeschooling their children and being in charge of that, but also all the domestic labor and, you know, washing of dishes and then, you know, everything else that they're responsible for that is not, you know, home maintenance and learning. And I remember reading all these quotes like back to back, and, you know, these women were captured by these outlets as being very mournful, right? Like, oh, you know, like this pandemic is getting in the way of, you know, me basically excelling in my career or starting this business or, you know, whatever for my children. But when I was reading their quotes and seeing between the lines, it just kind of seemed like they were all somehow expecting like white feminism to swoop in and save them. And especially having just come off this book and seeing, you know, the ways in which white feminism has eschewed any issue to do with domestic labor, paid parental leave, subsidized childcare. It was very apparent to me that like white feminism was never made for the situation that you are currently in. White feminism has always been an aspirational fantasy that is not engineered to help you with those exact problems. And so I hope for that cohort of women, you know, who is in that position right now, I hope that this pandemic has got them thinking more collectively in terms of legislation and systems that we should have in place as a country, especially so women, you know, whether they're domestic laborers or, you know, white collar workers or even very wealthy, you know, are not tasked with literally everything, because that is the place where our economic model falls apart.
Yeah, I mean, you use the word hope, which springs eternal. But what are you seeing? What do you really think is happening? Do you think we're moving in that direction?
hoping we are. I mean, a thing that I do think is fascinating for specifically people in white collar jobs and women especially is that a lot of these institutions are now being questioned in a
Right.
very big way in terms of like their policies, but also just what they advocate for, and also, you know,
Hmm.
the way in which like white collar work is structured. And so many of these workers, because of the culture in this country around like white collar work and how white collar work is weirdly fused with like ascension, equality, and like having value. I don't think we've really had an opportunity as a country to really separate ourselves from these institutions. And what I'm reading in a lot of, you know, this news coverage, especially about women, is that they don't really have this like community outside of work, and all they are expected to do basically is work all the time, whether it's, you know, taking care of their babies or sending emails or conference calls or whatever. And I'm hoping that all this distance from the way these institutions have in some ways like limited our imaginations about, you know, what could be or like what work is,
Right.
will incentivize people to think differently and expect differently from those institutions, but also frankly our government. I mean, we are, you know, one of like 3 industrialized nations that does not have paid federal parental leave. Like it's
Hmm.
an outstanding problem that keeps a lot of women honestly in poverty or in like very close to poverty circumstances. And that's happened with the pandemic too, and that a lot of women, you know, whether they're domestic laborers or, you know, do work in offices, have been laid off, or they have had to essentially quit their jobs to do all this domestic work.
Right. Right. No, I mean, I think that there is more, of course, there always is, but more to sort of examine about that, on a sort of in the context of race, right? Because I always
Hmm.
think about Toni Morrison, who talked about mothering and parenting as a freedom, you know, like
Yeah.
the most freeing thing that there is. But then there is this cost, and the economic aspects of it that really mess with that kind of
Hmm.
mentality and that real visceral feeling about it. Um, and I think that that's really different depending upon who has what and who doesn't, of course.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of conversations, national conversations on this topic, on exactly what we're talking about pre-COVID, always fell into these really unhelpful cul-de-sacs of like
Right.
stay-at-home moms versus
Right.
working moms. And it's like
Right.
it's such a poor framing to understand the ways in which we have systemically failed women and non-binary people,
Right.
and how the avenue of motherhood, um, and raising children, you know, whether that's like your own or, you know, in your own family, like helping out with like your sister's kids or whatever, is often pushed back in women's faces as an individual failure, you know,
Right.
whether they are able to prioritize the care of their babies or whether they can't and they have to work, you know, all the time to
Hmm.
financially support them. And that's not an
Hmm.
individual failure, that's a systemic failure.
That's right. That's right. Um, we've got some questions here,
Okay.
a whole bunch. Should I say who the person is? Should I say who the person is? Do we do that when we're in real time? Don't we? Or someone says their
I
name.
guess
I don't
I
know.
guess in real time people identify themselves and stand up with a mic.
Right. Right. Okay. Yeah. So this is Lisa Alexander. She says, "I am a white woman and a nonprofit domestic violence lawyer. I
Mhm.
find that lots of people in the movement still adhere to a version of feminism that excludes or doesn't fully consider a lot of clients and
Mhm.
lawyers. What tips do you have for highlighting those issues and encouraging them to develop a more intersectional approach?"
Well, one of the histories that I specifically go into in my book, just for context, is that specifically through white feminism, when a lot of white feminists were putting together like domestic violence shelters and even like rape hotlines and stuff, while they had good intentions, the avenues by which they went down to erect those centers basically did, not include, for instance, say Native women who have the highest sexual assault rates in this country. And a lot of white feminists, the way that they assembled these avenues for help and resources, basically cast that like a victim of domestic abuse or assault had to fall into a very specific paradigm to be considered a victim. And now I pull this in the book, but the rates of abuse for Native women in this country, assault and abuse, are very, very high. And that's going off of essentially data that isn't even considered like complete by my standard. I mean, I think a lot of people listening would know, obviously, that rape and assault are vastly underreported. So this is just what we know, and it's really high. And unlike like women in this country who are non-Native, Native women generally do not know their attackers. That was a very specific statistic I encountered much earlier in my career and then made sure to include in the book. Whereas most, I would say like mainstream like rape data that I've seen a lot in my career, they always emphasize, that most women know their attackers. And that is like a theme that repeats itself. But Native women do not. They are mostly stalked and abused by people they do not know, which is very telling. In terms of what you can do, I do not know your specific circumstances or your exact center or what is available to you. But I have found in doing the research for this book and reviewing a lot of data that, generally speaking, I don't think you should approach this as what should you do or what should I do or what should Rebecca do. Down through history, what has worked and been successful is working with other people and thinking more collectively, whether that's like starting, a union in your respective workplace or developing an advocacy group, or, you say you're a part of an organization already, to not think necessarily individually.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Here's a message. Here's a question from Michelle Herrera Mulligan.
I know her.
Yeah. What's it been like talking about the book now that it's out?
It's pretty great. Some of it I'm really enjoying sharing my research and sharing my analysis. One journalist I spoke to right before Christmas, she said a question that's really stayed with me, and I'm kind of curious to see if other journalists are going to go down this road. But she asked me if it was exhausting and emotionally draining to talk about white feminism, specifically with people who don't understand its harm. And I said, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
To constantly have to present it, as like a reactionary thesis, like white feminism gets the default. And then despite the hundreds of years of, all the activism of women who are non-white, I'm still on the sort of defense of that question. And Michelle, I wanted to say to you that I've been talking about you a lot during press, and what a genius job, honestly, you did with editing this project, and also making sure that all of these concurrent narratives in this book move one way. You are a genius.
That's nice. I love that. I do also anticipate that question in terms of the white gaze and surviving the white gaze and having to explain the white gaze. And I think, we just have to figure out how to, I think what, and maybe you feel this way, maybe you don't, but that you were able to approach this subject of white feminism on your own terms, right? I mean, you certainly did extraordinarily meticulous, beautiful research, but you also did what you wanted to do with this book, right?
Yes, very, very much so. I feel like I chose really well in terms of my editor, because I didn't necessarily have any struggles with her, about the approach or how, it should be or be presented. One of the things that makes me feel really satisfied with this book, especially now that it's out and people can read it, is that I really said everything that I want to say.
Right. Yeah.
And I feel like the research in itself was extremely rewarding to do, even though it could be frustrating at times, in that history affirmed for me a lot of suspicions I've always had about white feminism, the way it operates, but more specifically what its goals are.
Mm,
Um, a sort of like more confrontational moment I would always have with white feminists, especially earlier in my career, is like asking, like, what are you hurtling towards? Because it's
right.
all framed as this ambiguous, um, equality, but it's like that word, even like the way,
Right.
disabled groups have interpreted that word, the way that Chicanas have interpreted that word, the way that like Black lesbians have interpreted that word is
Yeah.
so different than what they have been advocating for well over 100 years. So I feel like doing the research was really satisfying in terms of a number of conversations I've had with women in my own life, literally other women were having with white feminists 100 years before I
Right.
did.
Right. Right. That's amazing. And that you're able to do that through line though is really fantastic, I think. Marcy Bianco. Hi, Koa. Hi,
Hi.
Rebecca. I know. Thank you so much for taking time to have this conversation. Here is my question. How do you recommend successfully pitching more nuanced articles focused on multiple identities and or communities simultaneously, to outlets that aim to amass eyeballs and commission articles based on potential views? Whew.
Hmm.
The question of all time. Yeah. I mean, we've both worked as editors, we've both worked as
Yeah.
writers.
It's
I mean, I think about it all the time. I'm not working as a full-time editor anymore, but I do think about it in terms of mentoring, young folks and trying to grapple with putting your voice on the map, getting people to read your work and creating new language and creating energy around it. And it's just very hard. It just is.
Yeah, it's extremely hard, and a lot of what she just asked, I mean, that was essentially my entire career in media.
Yeah,
Is like, how
exactly.
do I convince
Exactly.
this power holder and gatekeeper that like covering, queer identified women who have been assaulted by other women is an important story. Like,
Right,
how do I
right.
convince them of that? And the thing is, if I look at my own life, I don't, it's very hit or miss, because I did get that story published.
Yep.
And I did do that reporting, and that's out there, but there are many other things that they said no to, that, just live in pitches in my email inbox. And honestly, like, I'm not, I consider myself retired from leadership positions in media. I stepped down to do this book, and that's done. I'll always be a writer. I'll always write. But, like, people are still turning down stuff that I want
Yeah.
to write about.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not really all that different. So I think my only real substantial advice is just like keep pitching, because in my assessment it's just kind of a numbers game. Like, and journalists and writers who are listening and watching, as well as I do, that like you can pitch something that's very well thought out, very on brand, something you think that they would need. They will say no. And then something will happen 3 days later, and all of a sudden what you have pitched is very pertinent to the news cycle. So I think another thing to keep in mind is like so many newsrooms have diminished like just crazy, and this is before COVID. um, and so they don't have like a ton of resources to operate, so a lot of editors are just flying by the seat of their pants and really moving like minute to minute in terms of like generating content, appeasing their bosses, making sure they hit metrics. So my real only advice is just to keep pitching, and especially if you're a freelancer, if somebody doesn't want it, just pitch it somewhere else. Like,
Just
it
pitch it
doesn't
somewhere else.
mean,
Yeah.
just someone else will take it.
Right. And I also think that it's really important to be cognizant, like constantly mindful of what the goal is of pitching, getting the piece published, then what, right? Because freelancing, I mean, it is not for the, the
Mhm.
faint-hearted. It it's a hustle, it's a drag, it's all those things. But I remember when I was younger, thinking, okay, this is going to get published, and then I'll get another assignment, and then I'll get another assignment. That's not really how it works. Even
Yeah.
if something goes viral, it's like, do the work and do the stories that you want to do, that you find really interesting, because one, you'll write it better. Two,
Mhm.
that will come across in the writing. And three, that will be the satisfying thing.
Mhm.
And if it gets a lot of clicks and a lot of views, all the better. But I also agree that you got to just you got to keep it pushing. I think we have time for one more. There are other questions here. I don't know what the protocol is, but let me see. Let's see. This is a fascinating discussion. Thank you. Perhaps you cover this in the book, but going back to the title, I'm curious about your choice of the word suffragette instead of suffragist.
Mhm.
Suffragette is considered pejorative, coined by a journalist in 1906, I think, to make fun of those fighting for the right to vote. I did not know that. It is
Mhm.
literally diminutive. Was that a conscious choice to go along with this idea of white feminists who had a very limited lens? And by extension, are you saying here is a group of true suffragists, or truly inclusive suffragists, women of color fighting for rights, for example, that you believe went about the fight for the vote differently and in a better way? Very nice question, Kathy
Mhm.
Sherbrooke.
Yes, I did choose to go with suffragette, at least for the subtitle, very intentionally. I am very aware of that history, and I encountered it in my research. In the book itself, I shift back and forth between suffragette and suffragist. But as far as the subtitle goes, I chose to go with suffragette because my assessment through history is that that word has basically become a shorthand in our culture for those women, and that word has been reclaimed as part of suffragette history. And especially for readers who are not really all that familiar with the history of gender rights in this country, or like women's history specifically, I think suffragette is a very important shorthand and a term that they identify more so than suffragist. But to be clear, both are in the book.
Um, let's see. Vanessa Mobley, thank you for this conversation. I'm loving the book. I'm interested in the generational angles of your story. Do you feel that white feminism as practiced by your generation is a direct response to the white feminism of the generation ahead of you, or an extension? I'm a generation older than you, and I've seen white women of my generation more willing to, quote unquote, help out other white women in the workplace, especially
Hmm.
younger women, rather than their non-white peers.
Hmm. Hi, Vanessa. Thank you for coming. We're Instagram friends.
Oh,
I'm so
nice.
happy that so many people I know are watching. Thank you for
Yes.
coming and seeing us talk. I will say that as far as generations go within white feminism, I don't know if this directly answers your question or not, but I think that there have always been, like, if you look at feminism broadly, not just white feminism, there have always been a lot of ideologies and practices and different ways of approaching gender equality, for sure, in terms of like strategies, and like efforts, and also like what people are generally like working toward. In terms of white feminism specifically, was the question surrounding like what I think, like my generation is interacting with white feminism?
I mean, that seems sort of what I took from
Okay.
it.
Okay. I think that a really important thing to keep in mind with generational differences, if we're talking about white feminism, is that white feminism is extremely ageist and always has been. They have always put forward very young white women in their cause, and they
Mm-hmm.
generally gravitate towards issues that are very pertinent to young white women. And I explore this in the book, where like you can literally, to my assessment, even if you are a white feminist, you can age out of white feminism, mostly because the issues that are the most pertinent are, of younger women, but also in reviewing data for the book about like women who are, over 50, over 60, like different health issues that they have that are totally a result of institutional sexism, and also just like a lot of problems with our healthcare, their health causes that are directly overlooked by misogyny and by patriarchy are not considered part of a feminist call to action. And even on like a lot of, and I talk about this, like panels that I've been on with what I would assess to be white feminists for sure, there's always these really ageist jokes all the time about like older women, and like older women being very clumsy and like technologically illiterate, and like somehow, like not, up to speed with all of our like codes and like the way we think about gender. And I don't like to adopt that lens. I don't think that mocking older women or their needs is very conducive to a more holistic feminism.
That is our presentation.